Stand up.
Hello and welcome to the 1206th episode of Stand Up with Pete Dominic. I have got your headlines, your clips, and an amazing conversation with your favorite historian, Kenneth C. Davis, about his new book, The World in Books. 52 works of great short fiction. It is out and available today. You gotta go get it wherever you get your books. That conversation starts at 40 minutes into the show today. I've got a lot of headlines and a whole bunch of sound clips for you. I hope you had a great weekend. Here we are in the second week of October. Let's start those headlines right now because we can start with Friday's job numbers. The job numbers for September were out. The U.S. labor market remains strong. Employers added 254,000 jobs last month, far surpassing expectations, and unemployment ticked down. A great trend headed into the election, which is just 29 days away, everybody, and there'll be one more jobs report right before the election, it looks like. Friday the 1st we'll get those numbers. The election just 4 days after that. Hopefully they continue to be good. Of course, today is October 7th, and it is the 1-year anniversary of Hamas's attack on Israeli civilians. 1 year later, so much has transpired. Israelis, and NBC News writes, Israelis remain enraged and deeply shaken with families of Hamas remaining hostages suffering the gut-wrenching anguish of not knowing if their loved ones are even alive. The people of Gaza, meanwhile, have endured an unmitigated humanitarian catastrophe as Israel carries out one of the most intensive bombing campaigns in history, killed tens of thousands of Palestinians, many of them women and children, and reduced much of the Strip to ash and rubble. In the past 3 weeks, Israel has turned its attention north, and airstrikes and a ground invasion have killed around 1,800 people in Lebanon, driven 1.2 million from their homes, and now Israel and Iran teeter on the edge of all-out war. It's believed that 97 hostages remain in Gaza, including the bodies of at least 33 confirmed dead by the IDF. Hamas released 105 civilians during a week-long truce in late November. 4 hostages were released before that. 8 hostages have been rescued by troops alive, and the bodies of 37 hostages have also been recovered, including 3 mistakenly killed by the Israeli military as they tried to escape their captors. And as the war stretches on and expands into southern Lebanon, the humanitarian crisis is worsening in Gaza, where more than 41,600 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th. The U.S. Secretary General Antonio Guterres told the Associated Press back in September that he's, quote, never seen such a level of death and destruction as we are seeing in Gaza in the last few months. Palestinian deaths include more than 11,300 children and nearly 6,300 women, according to the health ministry. 90% of Gaza's population has been forcibly displaced at least once during the past year, and the numbers just continue to sound absolutely horrific and nightmarish as this conflict sees no end in sight a year later, this iteration of it at least. Should also mention that the Anti-Defamation League has found that cases of anti-Semitism in the U.S. have surged in the wake of the October 7th attack by Hamas last year. The number of anti-Semitic episodes in the United States surged to the highest recorded in 1 year period in the wake of the Hamas attack. The new figures released yesterday were about triple the number of cases reported to the organization during the same period a year before. The group identified more than 10,000 anti-Semitic incidents, which were split into categories such as verbal or written harassment, vandalism, and physical assault. The largest number of cases, 8,015, fell under verbal or written harassment, according to the figures. All right, now let's get to the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, and now another major storm expected to strike the west coast of Florida this week. But Federal Emergency Management Agency has deployed more than 1,500 personnel in communities battered by Hurricane Helene, testing the capacity of the 45-year-old agency with dwindling disaster relief money and limited staffing levels. While FEMA has enough money to meet the immediate needs of Helene survivors, it lacks enough funding for long-term disaster recovery efforts, a shortfall that the Biden administration officials are warning another storm could exacerbate. National Hurricane Center predicted yesterday that an intense hurricane with multiple life-threatening hazards will probably slam the west coast of Florida peninsula by mid this week. The storm's name is Milton, and I don't know why, because I thought it was supposed to be a K letter. I guess a bunch of other storms occurred in between then and this one that we didn't hear about. Anyway, it's expected to rapidly intensify and make landfall as Category 2 or even 3 hurricane on Wednesday. Experts are saying Helene is already one of the deadliest, costliest storms to hit the U.S. The last time a hurricane killed more than 100 people in the mainland United States was 2017 when Hurricane Harvey struck Texas. Only 8 hurricanes have killed more than 100 people since 1950. Communities struggle to get back on their feet. Hundreds still missing with search and rescue operations underway. One county in North Carolina, Buncombe County alone, has reported 35 deaths due to the storms. And Donald Trump and other Republicans are lying all about it. It's really disgraceful what they've been saying over the last couple of days, putting people in danger, eroding trust in government, and trying to hurt Democrats in charge. But Republicans have been standing up for Democrats, Republican governors in Georgia and in Tennessee as well. I'll get you some audio of them. Kamala Harris doing her best over the weekend campaigning in Michigan, where she met with Arab and Muslim leaders, also visited North Carolina to check on relief efforts after the hurricane there. And now a media blitz for the vice president. She's on 60 Minutes. She's on a popular podcast. She's sitting down with Stephen Colbert, Howard Stern, and The View this week. I think that's most of what she's doing, but probably will be more. Yesterday, Trump spoke for 2 hours in Wisconsin. The day before, he returned to Butler, Pennsylvania, where he was almost killed. And Elon Musk was there jumping up and down, telling everybody that they have to vote for Trump. It was super weird, and I can't stop watching the video. And the final headline I want to share with you is that yesterday, a Frontier Airlines flight appeared to catch fire during an emergency landing at Harry Reid International Airport, the Las Vegas airport, on Saturday night. The flight was from San Diego to Las Vegas. In the process of landing, when the pilots detected smoke and declared an emergency, and I mentioned that story just as I try to remind you every day, these are the exceptions. That's why they're headlines. Most, if not all, planes landed every day this week without incident like that. That's why it's news. These are the headlines, the bad things. Infinite acts of love being performed and committed in every moment, all the rest of the time. But those are your headlines from the weekend. And now let's get to some of the audio clips I've grabbed for you from the Sunday shows and the weekend. Let's start with comedy and end with comedy today. First, Jay Alcovan's hilarious impression of Donald Trump talking about returning to the scene of the crime, Butler, Pennsylvania. I really like this, so I wanted to start with it.
So we are back in Butler, PA, which stands for Pennsylvania. Okay, we're in Pennsylvania. It's a swing state, but I think we all know here that I'm going to win this state so strongly, because if I wasn't going to win the state, why the hell would they have shot me here? How about that? That's right, I was here not too long ago, and somebody tried to shoot me, a radical left Democrat who happened to be a registered Republican, which is sort of the perfect disguise for a radical left Democrat to be a registered Republican who loves guns. So they're resorting to tactics, which we've never seen before. We've never seen tactics like this before. And I tell you that we're going to have to get violent, okay? Look to your left and look to your, well, some of you don't know your left and right, but that's okay. Your vote still counts. Thank you. But just look to the people around you, okay? You low IQ monsters. Look around you, and the person next to you, maybe everybody next to you, has a gun, and that's important. And I want you to pick somebody near you and take them out, because they're probably a radical left Democrat posing as a MAGA supporter. And that's how we're going to purge. We're going to do the purge. And this was a great documentary I saw about how they cleaned up crime. Okay, and you'll notice if you watch any of the purge documentaries, not a single Haitian. Interesting. Okay, I guess the left didn't see these documentaries because they would have canceled them so bad. There was no pet eating and no Haitians in the Purge docu-series. And I think if we have incredible violent crime, just for maybe even half a day, we don't even have to do a full day, half of my first day as a dictator, we do the Purge, and we take out everybody who's bad, and we'll have a beautiful, beautiful world. It'll be nice. It'll be so nice. And I think it should start today in Butler. So nobody shoot me, because it's called a crime against your favorite president. But, start shooting each other, because some of you are probably radical left Democrats posing as MAGA. So let's do it. A preview of the Purge. Thank you, Butler, Pennsylvania. A wonderful place. let's make America dead again.
So good by J.L. Cauvin, and follow him and support him. He's off Broadway over the past 3 nights doing an off-Broadway performance as Trump. Really, really funny. And we love J.L. Cauvin. What can I say? All right, now let's move to Brian Stelter on CNN, going through all of the lies that have been told about the hurricane and Democrats and the relief efforts by Trump and his supporters.
I think what frustrates me, Caitlin, is we're seeing the best of humanity in the Carolinas and Georgia. We're seeing the worst of humanity on the internet. I made a list of some of the lies, right? Marjorie Taylor Greene claiming Democrats can control the weather and try to hurt Republicans by sending storms their way. Influencers saying FEMA spent all the hurricane relief money on immigrants. It's a lie. Others are claiming FEMA is stealing supplies, that corporations are kicking people out of their homes and confiscating property. Corporations are doing this. The death toll is being covered up. Helicopters are being banned from landing in relief zones. All of these are lies that are spreading on social media, and it's very hard to negate these lies with the truth, because the truth is boring and complicated and complex.
I mean, when FEMA has to put up a rumor page to address the rumors that are so rampant.
FEMA.gov, yeah.
North Carolina, a rumor response. I mean, that's not something you think you'd see. The North Carolina governor saying this actually is demoralizing to members of the National Guard who've been on the ground in his state for days.
I think.
All right. I thought that was pretty good. I also thought this was really good from Maria Cardona, also on CNN.
Boils my blood because I grew up in Puerto Rico, and I remember when Donald Trump came down to Puerto Rico and threw paper towels at us.
How could you forget?
Exactly. And so when he talks about, when he makes up out of whole cloth these ridiculous lies about the administration, which Republican governors have actually said, no, they are getting what they need from this administration. We have talked to President Biden. We have talked to Vice President Harris. They are responding absolutely adequately, more than adequately. We're getting what we need. Meanwhile, when Trump was president, he gutted FEMA. He did not want to give California the aid that they needed from wildfires until they had to show him a map that the places that needed the help were Republican. It is absolutely insanity what this man is doing. He's not just politicizing the storm, but he's putting people's lives in danger.
It takes a lot of nerve to do this during a hurricane.
Yeah, well, he's got a lot of nerve and no shame at all, I should say. And increasingly, I'm loving just random people doing rants on TikTok. I can't always attribute them. I just see them, I grab them, and I hope that you like them as much as I do. This is, I don't know, some woman on TikTok nailing it.
I need y'all to hear me when I say this. If you're one of the people that's getting online right now and saying that FEMA's only giving out $750 in assistance, or that FEMA's out of money because they've been diverting it towards the border or for migrants, or that FEMA is confiscating donations and money, fuck you. And I mean that to the depths of my soul with every fiber of my being. Because the only thing that tells me when you say shit like that is that you have been so fortunate to never have to use FEMA, to never have gone through something like this. I cannot describe to you the level of rage I have experienced over the last few days, watching y'all spread this mis and disinformation that will get people killed, that will keep people from getting the money and resources that they need to recover. There are multiple programs that you can apply for. Do you want to know how I know that? Because after Ian 2 years ago, that $750 is immediate assistance. That shit showed up in my account 6 hours after I applied for it. I applied for an SBA disaster loan for my business. There are multiple ways you can access money. There are multiple agencies. Do you want to know why FEMA is being tied to the border right now? Because it's under the control of the Department of Homeland Security, DHS. Do you want to know who did that? You can thank George W. Bush and Dick Cheney for that shit, because they did that after 9/11. FEMA's not running out of money because they're diverting it towards the border or for immigrants. They're out of money because Congress doesn't give them enough fucking money. If you're mad about the cap being set at $750 for emergency assistance, or that they're running out of money, call Congress. Take that fucking phone you recorded that shitty-ass video on and call Congress. Call your senators, call your representatives, and let them know there needs to be supplemental emergency funding right now. There needs to be a disaster relief bill right fucking now. I would have loved to see this level of outrage and anger and righteous indignation 6 years ago when it took Congress 12 fucking months to pass a disaster relief bill after Hurricane Michael.
Oh, yeah. I thought she was real good. She goes on for another couple minutes, too. Wonderful rant. Loved it. And now here is the very Republican governor, very MAGA governor of Tennessee, Bill Lee, also showing support for FEMA and the federal government.
There's a lot of misinformation. In fact, there's some belief and understanding that may be coming from foreign sources just to confuse on the ground what's happening here. There's no confiscation of supplies or of products coming in by FEMA or TEMA. Look, these people are in tears. And you see the TEMA director get emotional yesterday about the people that we are serving. I saw a county mayor every single day with tears in their eyes, emotional, serving the people alongside their FEMA and TEMA counterparts in their EOCs. There's nothing but commitment to serving the people in this state, and those who spread that kind of misinformation, it's deeply unfortunate that that's happening.
And now let's go to the governor of North Carolina, who's sitting in this clip with Kamala Harris. It's Roy.
Carolina, this has been an unprecedented disaster for our state. But what you are seeing, thanks to you and the Biden-Harris administration, state and local officials, volunteers, private organizations, this has been a massive, unprecedented response. We are deeply grateful for the federal resources that we have. FEMA has been on the ground with us since the very beginning of this. So we look forward to briefing and giving you details about the significant progress that's happening and all that we have to do. Unfortunately, we have 68 people who've lost their lives, but people are still working hard in search and rescue to save people and to surge resources into Western North Carolina. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Governor.
All right, here's Kamala Harris in response to that as she's sitting with the governor and leaders in North Carolina.
Thank you, Governor, and I thank you all, everyone here. I've talked with many of you within actually hours and certainly days of Helene hitting this beautiful state, and I thank you all for the work you've been doing around the clock. Administrator, you and I have talked many, many times, and your team on the ground are just doing extraordinary work. But the work that's happening here that is so positively impacting so many people is really an example of the best we can do when we bring resources together at the federal, state, and local level and tap into the kind of collegiality that produces results. And this is the work that you all have been doing. For the folks who are local, I also know what this means for each of you as a leader, to be a leader at a time that your own homes, your families, your friends, people you know, your community has been directly hit. For the folks that work in your various divisions and offices, I know that they've been showing up at a moment of need for others, even when their own families and their own homes have been directly impacted. I think that these moments of crisis bring out some of the best of who we can be and who we are. I've been seeing and hearing the stories from here in North Carolina about strangers who are helping each other out, giving people assistance in every way that they need, including shelter, food, and friendship and fellowship. And so I thank everyone for all the work that they've been doing.
All right, there's Kamala Harris in North Carolina doing her job. And now let's go to the FEMA administrator. This is Deanne Criswell. She was on, I think this is ABC's This Week, talking about the aftermath, the preparation for the next hurricane, and the manufactured controversy created by Trump and his supporters.
Let's start out with the recovery and rescue effort. Where do things stand right now?
Good morning, George. We are still actively supporting the governor in this search for individuals, but at the same time, we continue to move in critical commodities into the places that have been hard to reach. And our plan and what we're doing with them is to make sure that we can sustain that for as long as needed, as we know it's going to take time to repair the infrastructure and get access to all of the roads in the communities that either have limited access or no access at all. We've got thousands of responders on the ground right now, along with thousands of volunteers and the private sector, working alongside our state partners, the National Guard, the first responders in the community, meeting the needs of the people on the ground.
Do you have all the resources you need?
Absolutely, George. We moved resources in before this storm happened. We embedded our staff in the state to work side by side so we could quickly employ those resources to where they were needed. And as we continue to see how long we're going to have to provide this level of sustained support, we will continue to do that.
Let's talk about some of the misinformation that is out there, including these claims from former President Trump that FEMA is about $1 billion short because money has been going to undocumented immigrants. Also, that the Republican areas of the state are being intentionally ignored in some fashion.
You know, it's frankly ridiculous and just plain false. This kind of rhetoric is not helpful to people. You know, it's really a shame that we're putting politics ahead of helping people, and that's what we're here to do. We've had the complete support of the state. We've had the local officials helping to push back on this dangerous, truly dangerous narrative that is creating this fear of trying to reach out and help us or to register for help. You know, people need resources, and we need them to get into the system. And it's just, you know, a shame that people are sitting home on their comfortable couches while we have thousands of people here on the ground that have left their own families to be able to help those in need.
So much is going viral online as well. One user suggested yesterday that a militia should go against FEMA. It got more than 500,000 views. What kind of impact has this had on the recovery effort?
It has a tremendous impact on the comfort level of our own employees to be able to go out there, but it's also demoralizing to all of the first responders that have been out there in their communities helping people, FEMA staff, volunteers, the private sector that are working side by side with local officials to go out and help people. I need to make sure I can get the resources to where they're needed. And when you have this dangerous rhetoric like you're hearing, it creates fear in our own employees. And we need to make sure we're getting help to the people who need it.
There are reports that another storm may be heading to the region. Are you ready for that? What advice do you have for people who are living there right now?
We are absolutely ready. We have started planning for this days ago, even before it formed. We know that it's headed straight towards Florida. I reached out to Governor DeSantis this morning, and I believe I'm having a call with him shortly after this interview. We'll move more resources in there to support their needs, but we have a lot of people in Florida already helping to support the response and the recovery from Hurricane Helene, but also previous storms in Florida. So we're working with the state EOC to understand what their requirements are going to be so we can have those in place before it makes landfall.
All right, there you go. FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell on ABC yesterday with George Stephanopoulos. Now let's go to the Transportation Secretary, or the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. Here's what he had to say about all of the lies that are being told.
Yeah, it's false. It's easy to prove that it's false. And, you know, without getting to the campaign side of things, I can just tell you this is an administration that has been on the ground from day one, actually before day one, pre-positioning people to do what FEMA does best and what emergency responders do best, which is to help people in need. Now, the scale of the devastation here is colossal, which is exactly why it is so important that nobody be throwing around false statements or distracting people from the very real and urgent needs on the ground. I was at the FEMA Command Center, saw the work that's happening, part of which, of course, is through our department, trying to help restore roads, bridges, give people good route information so that they can get emergency vehicles in when the normal road or bridge has been washed out. All of us working together to solve problems for people and help them through this unbelievably shocking, devastating damage.
All right, there's Pete Buttigieg, Secretary of Transportation, on all of that. Now let's go to two celebrity endorsements. Did you see this? The Boss came out and supported Kamala Harris in a statement that he made, a video that Bruce Springsteen made in support of Kamala Harris. I thought this was pretty good, and I wanted to share it with you if you haven't seen it yet.
Donald Trump is the most dangerous candidate for president in my lifetime. His disdain for the sanctity of our Constitution, the sanctity of democracy, the sanctity of the rule of law, and the sanctity of the peaceful transfer of power should disqualify him from the office of president ever again. He doesn't understand the meaning of this country, its history, or what it means to be deeply American. On the other hand, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are committed to a vision of this country that respects and includes everyone, regardless of class, religion, race, your political point of view, or sexual identity. And they want to grow our economy in a way that benefits all, not just a few like me on top. That's the vision of America I've been consistently writing about for 55 years. Now, everybody sees things different, and I respect your choice as a fellow citizen. But like you, I've only got one vote, and it's one of the most precious possessions that I have. That's why, come November 5th, I'll be casting my vote for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz.
Another celebrity endorsement, and this one definitely matters in Michigan because, of course, he is a proud son of Lansing. He graduated from Michigan State, won a national championship there. It's Magic Johnson. He was on stage at the rally in Lansing over the weekend.
To elect my friend, Kamala Harris, President of the United States. I'm here because I've known Kamala for over 20 years. Cookie and I supported her run for Attorney General back in the state of California, her run for Senator, and now we support her as the VP, but now the biggest moment for all of us November the 5th, we have to do all we can to elect Kamala Harris as the next president of the United States. She wants to build up the middle class, and I know something about the middle class because I come from a middle class family. My father worked 30 years for Fisher Body.
All right, Magic with the endorsement and the boss as well. Now, I just like this rant from George Conway. He was talking to Alex Wagner on MSNBC.
George, just first, because you're a sort of student of Trump's strange psyche, what does the clearly confessional nature of these accusations tell you about, I don't know, where his head is at right now?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's a form of projection. He attributes to others motives that he himself has. But it's more than that. I mean, the words that came to mind when I read about this controversy today is the grosse Lüge. That's German. I don't speak German, so forgive my pronunciation. But grosse Lüge is big lie. It means big lie. It was a phrase coined by Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf in 1925 for a propaganda technique by which you tell as big a lie as possible so that people will believe bigger lies. They will believe bigger lies more than they will believe smaller lies because they simply think that it's impossible for anybody to have the temerity to tell such an amazingly large lie. But Donald Trump does that as a matter of course. He's a pathological liar and a sociopath. This is par for the course for Donald Trump, just as his lies about the supposedly stolen election in 2020 were grosse Lüge. And this is what he does, and it's why he is a cancer on American public life that must be removed once and for all.
Yeah, well done. Love that. And speaking of the cancer, one of the cancers is the big lie and many other big lies around it and like it. And Mike Johnson continues to tell it. Here he is with George Stephanopoulos not being able to admit that Trump lost the election of 2020.
So it's very clear you're not going to condemn the baseless suggestion the Democrats are behind the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. I want to ask you another question.
There's so many. Please, anything else?
Well, you have the opportunity to condemn it if you want. You have that opportunity, but we can move on now. I do want to ask you a question that Senator Vance did not answer at this week's debate. Can you say unequivocally that Joe Biden won the 2020 election and Donald Trump lost?
See, this is the game that is always played by mainstream media with leading Republicans. It's a gotcha game. You want us to litigate things that happened 4 years ago when we're talking about the future. We're not going to talk about what happened in 2020. We're going to talk about 2024 and how we're going to solve the problems for the American people. I think this game that's played all the time, I'm not going to engage in it. We're not talking about that. Joe Biden has been the president for almost 4 years. Everybody needs to get over this and move forward. That's what we need to talk about. What happens on November 5 and the days after that? Important, and that's what the Americans demand for us to talk about.
So, like Senator Vance, you cannot say unequivocally that Joe Biden won the 2020 election and Donald Trump lost?
George, I'm the Speaker of the House. I work with the President of the United States all the time. Joe Biden has been the president for 4 years. There's not a question about this, okay? It's already been done and decided, and this is a gotcha game that's played, and I'm not playing it. I want to talk about the future. Let's talk about policies. Ask me anything you want on any challenging issue. Let's put that out there for the American people. That's what they need to hear.
Well, it's President Trump who every single day, former President Trump, at just about every rally is saying that the election was rigged, that he won, and that Joe Biden lost. I'm just saying if you accept that or not.
George, I'm not going to play the game. Ask me any question on any issue that's facing the country. They're some of the biggest issues that we face. How about
you're done? How about I'm good? Thank you, Mike Johnson. He's the Speaker of the House, and he lies and works for the hollow barrel that is Trump, because they're all hollow barrels, just empty with no principles, morals, or values at all. Speaking of which, here's Tom Cotton playing the same song and dance with Kirsten Welker on NBC's Meet the Press. And I'm glad they're asking these Republicans this. They should open every interview with any Republican who's still supporting the big lie. And when they're asked why they are being asked about it, or that they should move on and look to the future, they always should say, even before the question, the reason I'm asking you this is because the disgraced former president is still lying about this, and he has eroded trust in American elections, which were the most secure in the world up until, well, they still are, until he started lying about them.
Different. I want to talk about one of the big moments this week from the vice presidential debate. We just played it in the open when Senator J.D. Vance refused to say that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. I want to put this question to you, Senator, just to put this to rest. Can you say definitively here and now that Donald Trump did lose the 2020 election?
Kristen, Joe Biden was elected president in 2020. It was an unfair election in many ways. I mean, you had states that were changing their election practices or election laws, sometimes in violation of their constitution. You had networks combining with big tech to suppress what we now know to be a truthful story about Hunter Biden's laptop and the evidence that it exposed about Biden family corruption. So obviously Joe Biden was elected president. We know that in part because...
But did Trump lose?
Joe Biden was elected, Kristen. There's a process by which we elect presidents. There's votes in November. You have an electoral college vote. You certify the election, and then you have the inauguration. Joe Biden was elected president. Everything has gone to hell in a handbasket as a result of it.
As you know, though, I mean, it has been stated that this was one of the most secure elections in U.S. history. But do you just not want to say that Trump lost? Why not just say the simple...
Kristen,
if Biden is president, can you just simply say... Trump lost.
Joe Biden was elected president in 2020. That's why we have runaway inflation. That's why we have more than 10 million illegals in this country. And to go back to the point about the 2020 election, it was very irregular. You had networks, to include this networks, conspiring with big tech to suppress evidence of Biden family corruption. You had Democratic states and cities like Pennsylvania, like Philadelphia, changing their election practices on the fly. That's one reason why President Trump and the Republican National Committee is so focused on election integrity in this election, to make sure that Democrats aren't doing things like they're trying to do in Pennsylvania, counting absentee and mail-in ballots that don't have dates or that have the wrong date.
And there's no proof that happened. And again, just to be clear, as I said initially, Trump did take his case to court more than 60 times, didn't win those cases.
All right, Tom Cotton continuing to lie for the disgraced former president. And now I just have to play a brief clip of Trump in North Carolina saying that if he's elected, he's going to rename Fort Liberty Fort Bragg again. And everybody goes crazy because we love Confederate generals in this country. And I play it because I ask Kenneth C. Davis about this at the end of our interview. It's only about 15 seconds. Here you go.
Question that I asked. Should we change the name from Fort Liberty back to Fort Bragg? First question. Right? So here's what we do. We get elected. I'm doing it. And we're leading in all the polls. We should get elected. But remember this, they cheat like hell. We got too big to rig.
All right, there you go. There is the disgraced former president promising to rename a United States military base over a Confederate traitor. You can hear more about why that matters with Kenneth Davis at the end of our interview. But now I think we need some laughs. Let's go to the boys at Saturday Night Live's Weekend Update, Colin Jost and Michael Che.
Well, guys, the election is exactly 30 days away. Just think, in only 30 days, this whole nightmare will be nowhere close to over. Earlier tonight, Donald Trump held a rally at the site of his first assassination attempt, which I have to admit is very brave of him. Though it was interesting that right before Trump spoke, he sent J.D. Vance out in a long red tie and a blonde wig. Elon Musk, seen here trying to jump to Mars, joined Trump on stage at the rally tonight, which may be the last time Trump and Musk will be together until they co-host our Christmas show.
It was reported that last month the U.S. added 245,000 new jobs. Unfortunately, they were all Diddy accuser. It was announced that Sean P. Diddy Combs' sex trafficking case has been assigned to a new judge, one that Diddy hopes is cool with rapes. I'd do it for that guy.
Yeah, sure. It was reported that Diddy once invited Prince Harry and Prince William to one of his parties, but they did not go. Although before Diddy could even finish writing the invite, Prince Andrew was there.
Yesterday, the devil went down to Georgia. No, I'm kidding. Donald Trump traveled to Georgia to survey the damage from Hurricane Helene, which is bold because nothing scares Trump more than high winds. It was reported that Donald Trump has refused to release his medical records, and I bet I know what he's hiding, but I'm not allowed dementia it.
And you may have already forgotten, but this week was also the vice presidential debate between Mumford and Dad. This debate was so white it made me look Haitian. Now, the debates are apparently all finished, and I'm upset. How did we never get to see RFK Jr. in a debate? How were we robbed of that? I love that RFK Jr. admitted he dumped a dead bear in Central Park, he chainsawed the head off a dead whale, strapped it to the roof of his car like a Christmas tree, and he told us a worm was living in his brain, eating through his head, and still everyone is like, you know who's weird? J.D. Vance.
This week, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene tweeted, "Yes, they can control the weather." And I don't know who they is, but it has been a suspiciously nice Rosh Hashanah weekend.
That's not a flaw?
That's right. 2 claps Che, no claps Jost.
Damn it. Don't clap for that. That's the third for him. President Biden made a surprise appearance at a White House press briefing on Friday, and it's not a great sign when you're at the White House and people are like, whoa, what's the president doing here? In honor of Jimmy Carter's 100th birthday, more than 4,000 children around the country sent him hand-drawn cards bearing messages like, who are you? And my mom made me do this.
Hung Cao, a Republican candidate for Senate in Virginia, criticized drag queens and implied that they are not tough enough to serve in the military, which is sad because Hung Cao is a fantastic drag name.
It was revealed that Daniel Day-Lewis is coming out of his 7-year retirement to film a new movie. And you won't believe it, it's Shrek 6.
Richard Branson has launched a new free online university for people with dyslexia. You can check it out at www.dyslexiacom.com.
A woman in Italy has set a new world record for having the world's thickest tongue. Reached for comment, the woman said,
Boston's first lesbian bar in decades, called Danny's Queer Bar, has officially opened its doors. Well, curtains. But even if you don't drink, it's a great place to eat out. Okay, 2.5?
I'm not counting that. It was reported that a man in Austria who was high on mushrooms used an axe to amputate his own penis. Worse, then he was like, ooh, another mushroom. It tells the story.
All right, there you go. Wow, a 40-minute news segment. Probably too much, but you're always warned. You can always jump ahead to the interview if you want, but that's a lot for over the weekend. As always, there's a lot that happens, and I try to grab as much of it as I can for you. But now it's time to get to my friend Kenneth C. Davis. He's my favorite historian. Don'tKnowMuch.com. Go get all of his books. And he's got a really great one. It is out today. It's called The World in Books. From ancient times to the present day, it offers a wide-ranging historical education through pleasure reading and a fantastic introduction to some of the most thought-provoking, profound, and interesting nonfiction works of all time. From Sun Tzu's The Art of War to Bell Hooks' All About Love, as well as such recent classics as Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickel and Dimed and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's We Should All Be Feminists. Kenneth C. Davis' guide suggests a world of nonfiction books and explains why they're so historically meaningful and culturally relevant today. Perfect guide for the modern day reader. I love this book. These 52 selections provide an ideal way to explore some of the most enduring, influential books ever published, introducing us anew to a world-shaping historical figures, events, and ideas. I learned so much prepping for this and reading this book. I love Kenneth C. Davis. I love all of his work, and I always love when he joins me for a conversation about it. Let's do it right now. Kenneth C. Davis is back. He is my favorite historian. He should be your favorite historian, and he is out with another book because he's also a prolific author and writer. The World in Books, 52 works of great nonfiction. I have been waiting for this book and excited to talk with you about this book since I knew it was going to be a thing. Congratulations. Welcome back.
Thank you very much, Pete. And just one short correction, literally a short
already?
Correction. Yeah, it's 52 works of great short nonfiction. It's a real emphasis there because this, like my previous book, Great Short Books, is about books that you can sit down and read in a week or less. Some of them you can sit down and read in one sitting. This, if you remember, I discovered during the pandemic the value of reading, but because for me, like many people, my attention span was short. I really focused on reading short books. For Great Short Books, I had read short novels, and now I'm reading short nonfiction. So everything's under 200 pages in accessible language, and it's supposed to be about the pleasure of reading, not as escape, but as an incentive to learn, to be inspired, to fire your imagination, but most of all, to whet your curiosity about learning more, because books are really about learning how to think. And that's why I think this book is so important. Obviously, I think it's an important book because I talk about great books from the beginning of recorded time right up to modern times. But it's really about how important books are to our world, especially at this moment.
Yes, you really cover all of it because you start with the Bible and Plato and Aristotle all the way up to Michael Pollan and Christopher Hitchens, but I think I just mentioned only men, and I think the most important part of this book and all of your work is how inclusive you are with female writers, women, people of color, LGBT folks that don't get a fair shake. And you always make the point, to be clear, they didn't write as much because they weren't allowed to, and for other reasons. Talk a little bit about how you looked at these books in through that lens, so it's not just men, especially white men.
Right. This is not a bunch of old dead white men, but I have a lot of respect for a lot of old dead white men. They had some really important ideas, and they've shaped society. They've shaped our thinking throughout history. We don't want to throw out all of the old dead white men, a few of them, but Voltaire and Thomas Paine are old white dead men, but their ideas are as alive and important to us today as they have ever been. That's why I include them. I did set out with this book like great short books, to try and have a balance in terms of men and women writers. It was more difficult in this case because, as you just said, women were not taught to read or write until fairly recent in contemporary history. In fact, the first and only woman from the classical period in this selection is Sappho. And that raises another point because Sappho wrote poetry. And so is poetry nonfiction? I make the argument that it is because in those times, almost everything was written in verse, but the ideas are still there. And so I was really fascinated because I've always heard this name Sappho of Lesbos, which is where we get the word lesbian. And Sappho was a woman who wrote love poems to other women. So it really was a chance to not only explore who she was and where she fit into the classical world of Greek classical poetry, but also some of the themes of same-sex love going back to the earliest recorded literature. And so that's why these books are not only great works of, quote, literature, but they are books that speak to us today. And that was one of the reasons, one of the real keys to what I was doing when I chose these books. Obviously, I started off with the idea they have to be short. I also wanted them to be pleasurable to read, that this was not like slogging through Philosophy 101 back in college and reading. So I didn't want those books that were just good for you and you must read this, but something that was pleasurable. And that was one of my key ground rules for including books in this. But I also wanted books that are consequential. They had an impact in their time, and I would argue they are still consequential today. They speak to us today. That's another reason I talk about accessibility. Reading writers whose language, whose ideas still speak to us today. I wanted relevance. Hiroshima, written in 1946, the story of the dropping of the first atomic bomb, actually really the aftermath of the dropping of the atomic bomb. Certainly one of the most consequential books published in the 20th century and still speaks to us today because the threat of a nuclear holocaust still hovers over our heads and it's not going away. So that's why I really wanted to focus on books that, no matter what time or place they were written, still speak to our lives today, whether it's about same-sex love, atomic war, certainly about fascism and racism and all the isms that are still significant in our time. You'll find them all in this book.
There was only one book that I was surprised to see in there, and my opinion on such things is very low, but I have to ask why you included it, because it almost felt like it didn't fit, but I know it did, because all these books fit the criteria that you spell out for us here. But Michael Pollan, Food Rules, An Eater's Manual. Why that one?
Michael Pollan, A Food Rule, is because it fits into all of my key areas of concern. First of all, it's timely, it's consequential, it's accessible, and it certainly speaks to us today. It's certainly written in a easy, fun, read along, read these 81, I think, is the number of rules that Michael Pollan lays out. But these are books that speak about how we should live and looking at the way we live and what is more important to the way we live than the way we eat. And not only in terms of our health, in terms of eating the way Michael Pollan lays it out in his books. I think eat food, mostly plants, not too much is the basic idea.
Yeah.
But he's speaking about it certainly in terms of the health benefits of eating well. He's speaking about it in terms of the incredible corporatization, the capitalism that's behind the food industry today, which is a really important issue for our health, our well-being, and our children's well-being, but also very significant. What we eat has a lot to do with the environment. The way food is produced has a tremendous impact on ecological concerns. And when we talk about the most important issues of our time, certainly climate has to be at the top of the list. And Michael Pollan is talking about food in terms of climate. So that's why I think that this is a really important book. It's a fun book. It's an accessible book. but it's really a wise book that talks to us about how to make our lives better. And I think almost all of the books in this collection, all 52 of them, in some way reflect on that very fundamental idea. Reading books to make our lives better, to think about how I can change to make my life better, to make the world better.
So well said. And that's exactly, I feel like, the effect that it has on me. But I feel that way about all of your work. And you also include Under the Sea Wind by Rachel Carson, and one of the most respected modern environmentalists who also happens to be a woman is Elizabeth Colbert. And you include her Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future. And I mentioned those two because I asked you about Michael Pollan, and they certainly fit in. You've got it all covered here. We talked about, just mentioned anti-racism as well as sexual orientation and gender. You've got that covered. But let me just go back a minute, because you have this quote that you include, which I think is really important to just set the table a little bit here at the beginning of your book. Books are weapons in the war of ideas. Who said that, and when and why is that so important?
That comes from a quote. It's a quote. It's not a direct quote. It comes from something Franklin D. Roosevelt said during World War II. And the book opens with this introduction that is called Books Are Weapons in the War of Ideas, because in 1933, and I described this exactly in opening the book, the Nazis burned books. In Berlin, 1933, they burned tens of thousands of books, not only in Berlin, but across Germany. Students came from universities and they chanted what they called fire oaths as they're throwing these books into these huge pyres, burning piles of books. They were books that the Nazis deemed as immoral, as attacking the history of the country, as attacking the great figures in the country. So all the reasons that people censor books today were the reasons that the Nazis were throwing books on the fire in 1933. And by the way, among those books were people like Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, Karl Marx, who is in The World in Books, important German writers, many of them Jewish, but also Ernest Hemingway, Jack London, Helen Keller, who is also in The World in Books. These books were being burned because they did not like the ideas of these Americans. And that's really the reason books get censored and burned. People don't like those ideas and they're trying to suppress them. So about 10 years later, after the Nazis burned books, the United States started a program during World War II called Armed Services Editions. They were going to give books away free to American soldiers, sailors, airmen, nurses, and doctors on the front lines. And they produced millions of books and gave them away free to service people. And these books became treasured by the people. And part of it was morale boosting, but part of it was exactly what Franklin D. Roosevelt said. He said, you cannot burn ideas. You cannot put ideas in a concentration camp. And then he ends up saying, we are in a war of ideas, and books are weapons in this war. And I believe that we are, of course, are in a war of ideas right now, a very powerful war of ideas. It's certainly what is at stake in this election. As we get closer to that, it is behind all of this book banning and censorship. It is behind the decisions that schools are making to take certain history out of the history classes. These are wars of ideas, and we have to fight very powerfully against them. And that is one of the reasons I wrote this book. Certainly to make a book that was enjoyable for people to read, open them up to some new ideas, but really emphasize the idea that books matter, and books change us, books change society, and we better be very careful when we're in an age where people are suppressing books, keeping books out of libraries, taking them out of schools, threatening to burn them in some cases, and also attacking librarians and school teachers over books. It's an unthinkable idea in many respects, but it's been around for a very long time in American history.
You, like many other historians and authors, have been warning about what we're actually living through right now, because in many ways it's very parallel or similar to history. Not too long ago, you mentioned Timothy Snyder and his work on tyranny, 20 lessons from the 20th century. You wrote your own book about strongmen a couple of years back, which was sadly kind of prescient, I suppose it'd say, where you documented the stories of, what, was it 5 of
Right.
strongmen?
5 of history's worst dictators, authoritarians, murderous dictators. Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, and then Saddam Hussein a little more recently. And I should make this point that one of the things that all of those autocratic leaders do, and this ties into what we're talking about right here, one of the first things they always do is start to round up the writers and then create lists of books that are that are prohibited. First, they come for the books. We think that first they come for the Jews or the gays or some other group, but no. First, they come for the books. That is often the first step. Mussolini had a program that he started in 1920. It was called confino, which in Italian it essentially meant internal exile. And instead of just taking people off and murdering them or throwing them in prison, he took writers, intellectuals, socialists, anarchists, communists. Somebody who made a joke about Mussolini in a streetcar would get taken away. And he sent them to islands or to small villages where they were completely cut off. He didn't want to just kill them because that would be too provocative. So he just removed them. He said, I removed these people the way a doctor removes an infectious patient from the community. So this is the first thing that the authoritarian does. They come after the writers, the thinkers, because those are the people who are a threat to their power.
Right.
And that's what books represent, a threat to power.
So you also include some religious texts, the book of Genesis and the Quran, and probably more that I'm missing here. But why?
I think that part of my approach for 40 years of writing books, and certainly more than 30 years since I started the Don't Know Much About series, is to educate people about the things they never learned, or maybe they learned and forgot, or maybe they learned all wrong. And nothing is important, particularly right now, than the idea of what faith means in our society and in the world, the larger world around us. So I think that to be an educated person, you must understand, you must know what these basic documents of the world religions are. First of all, they have shaped civilization. They've shaped history in many ways. They shaped our sense of morality and right and wrong, whether they were right or wrong. And I think it also gets to the point that we need to understand what is different. One of the great problems in the world, and it has been throughout history, and certainly is right now, is that the idea of the other, othering things. And one of the books in this collection is by Toni Morrison, and it's called The Origin of the Other. When we make people different, when we make people strange, foreign, unusual, their ideas are remote from our own, that is the beginning of a very dangerous road towards eventually putting people in ovens. So that's why I included these works of faith, because I think to be an educated person, you need to understand what the great religions of the world have said and done and how they've sometimes been misinterpreted. So there is a chapter on the book of Genesis. Genesis, like all the books in the Bible, is a book. And the Bible is not one book. It's a collection of many books. So I chose Genesis from the Old Testament and the Gospel of St. Luke for the New Testament, because many people might know some of the stories or have heard some of the stories or sat in church and been told the stories, but they've never read them for themselves. And Genesis is the perfect example to me of this fabulous collection of stories that have absolutely influenced history and have influenced civilization, still continue to this day. But I would say a great many people have never read the book of Genesis for themselves. So, for instance, Genesis starts with the story of creation. That's in chapter 1. In chapter 2, there's another story of creation. Most people don't know that Genesis has 2 stories of creation. The second one has Adam and Eve. The first one never mentions Adam and Eve, the apple, the tree, the snake, all of that. That comes in chapter 2. Why are there 2 stories of creation? Why are they different? This is the Bible. It's all supposed to be true. It's all supposed to be exactly right. How could there be 2? So I walk people through these controversies, these things that they've never thought about because they've never read them for themselves, just so that people have a better understanding. This is about continuing education. This is about being a lifelong learner, which I have always thought my books are a way for people to continue their education.
It's the perfect phrase to refer to anybody who would like and support your work and be a fan of it. I wanted to be a lifelong learner. I wasn't sure how to be because school didn't always work for me. So I got schooled by you in your books. And I wanted to be a lifelong learner. And then you were the water that I went to and I continue to. So
thank you.
Just an addition to that.
Can I stop you for a second because we're obviously covering a lot of ground here, but you mentioned before, I think Helen Keller and a couple of the other books, and I know Rachel Carson, Helen Keller, and Elizabeth Colbert. I wanted to point out here that one of the things I do in the World in Books is talk about these people, these authors, and give their biography to try and establish who they were and in the times they lived. And to me, it's putting on my historian's hat, and rather than just looking this as a piece of literature, but looking at it as a document that was created in a place and time. And some of these people are so fascinating that I really enjoyed the biographical aspect of it. For instance, Rachel Carson, most people have heard that name and they immediately think of Silent Spring, which is the book she wrote in the 1960s in which she talked about the danger of DDT and other pesticides and how they were killing the birds. And it was a book that absolutely changed the country and it changed the world. It was the book on which the environmental movement was created. I included a book called Under the Sea Wind, which was Rachel Carson's very first book. A fascinating story. It was written in the Depression. She had grown up. She became a marine biologist. She had never seen the ocean, but she was fascinated by it until she went to college and she was taken up to Woods Hole in Massachusetts. And she was really fascinated by it. It was the Great Depression. There were no jobs for women marine biologists at the time. She became a freelance writer for the U.S. Fisheries Bureau. And she was assigned to write a pamphlet for the Fisheries Bureau. She comes back a few days later and gives it to her boss, and he says, "I'm sorry, this won't do. It's too good. You have to send." So she actually sends it then to, I believe it was the Atlantic magazine. So there's this marvelous story about the sea and the migrating animals, the birds, the fish, the eels, 3 separate chapters. It's poetic in the sense that the book of Genesis is poetic, but it also created this sense of living in a world in which we were part of the environment. And she never uses the word environment or ecology, but she wrote this brilliant book. Unfortunately, it came out about a week before Pearl Harbor. And so it really disappeared in many ways. First of all, they couldn't print many books anymore because there was paper rationing, and nobody was paying attention to books after Pearl Harbor. Later on, she wrote another book, and people went back and said, "Wow, this book is pretty good. Let's go back and look at." So she actually had 2 books at one time that were on the bestseller list, two books in this trilogy of books about the sea. And that's why I included Under the Sea Wind. Very different in many ways from Silent Spring in that it's really showcases her talents as a great writer. Most people would think of her as a great scientist, environmentalist, but she was a really great and poetic writer. And that's one of the things, again, that I tried to emphasize in these selections. I picked books that I really find pleasurable. The other name I'm going to mention, I think I mentioned it in terms of the Nazi book burnings, is Helen Keller. Why would the Nazis burn a book by this little blind girl who everyone admired? Helen Keller, most of us never learned this. We got it as far as she learns to spell water in The Miracle Worker. That's
right.
Most of us, it stopped there, whether you saw the Patty Duke version when she's Helen Keller or the Patty Duke version where she's Annie Sullivan. They're great. It's a great story.
Who's Annie Sullivan?
Annie Sullivan was the woman who taught Helen Keller how to sign and speak.
Patty Duke played both roles?
She did. She was the young Helen Keller in the original, which starred Anne Bancroft as Annie Sullivan. And then Patty Duke later played Annie Sullivan, and the woman who was I can't remember her name right now, she was the little girl on Little House on the Prairie.
Ingalls. Laura Ingalls. That's the character name. Well, anyway, the point is, you were saying Helen Keller's work was
burned by the Nazis. Why? Why was Helen Keller work? So I included a book that she wrote called The World I Live In. But Helen Keller, first of all, went to Radcliffe, went to college, extraordinary story, wrote her own autobiography and became internationally famous for this. But then she became a socialist. She was very closely involved with Eugene V. Debs, the socialist who actually went to prison during just after World War I because he was advising people not to go to the draft. Helen Keller was a rabid socialist. She was one of the founders of the American Civil Liberties Union. And I thought, gee, they didn't tell me that one back in school when we read The Miracle Worker. So these are the kind of surprising stories I like to find and bring to the reader, just to make this experience a little more rich, a little more interesting.
Well, you certainly do it. I was surprised, however, to see you include and come out as a communist. Kenneth Davis comes out as a communist in his new book with the Communist Manifesto. I'm very surprised. I didn't realize that you had those views.
I am not a communist. I wouldn't even say I'm a socialist. No, this is, again, an example of taking a book that is one of the most profoundly influential books in history, certainly in modern history, written in the late 19th century and then goes on to become the foundational work for Marx, Lenin. Marx is the author with Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong. Go down the list of communist leaders. For them, they took of the Communist Manifesto and turned it to their own purpose. So this is another case of my wanting to say, you may not agree with one word that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels write, but you cannot ignore the fact that this is one of the most important pieces of writing in human history, certainly in modern history. So know it, understand it, and don't be afraid of it. We were talking about censorship. In the 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy, the opposite of Eugene McCarthy, Senator Joseph McCarthy started to go through libraries and pull out books because he claimed they were socialist. Libraries had to pull Karl Marx off the shelves. And this was a really powerful moment in 1953 when whole libraries were being cleared out of books that even had a hint of socialism or communism. And at the time, President Eisenhower said faintly, don't join the book burners. But he actually didn't do too much to stop Joseph McCarthy from doing this. And Joseph McCarthy had a young man working with him at the time, a young attorney, who he sent to Europe to clear out all the libraries in the State Department. That fellow's name was Roy Cohn.
No way.
Yes. This story has a lot of...
Donald Trump's mentor, in case anybody didn't know.
Donald Trump's mentor, and really, when you look back at it,
spiritual leader.
one of the most dangerous men in modern American history. So Roy Cohn was sitting by Joseph McCarthy's side during the famous McCarthy hearings when he was going after communists and socialists in the government, he claimed. This is a book about books, but I'm never too far from the historian, so I need to tell these stories as well.
Talk to me about one of the books that deals with sexual orientation. Obviously, you have a lot of feminist writers, and we haven't gotten to the race issue. But to me, you as a historian understand this as well as anybody. But what we're seeing now with the book bans, obviously we're seeing entire states and legislatures voting to not teach things like African American history and so on. That's censorship, in my opinion. But so now we also seen in local communities like mine, parents coming and mentioning specific books that are in the library. And certainly it deals with race and gender, but a lot of it just has to do with sexual orientation too. And those books are generally speaking in the libraries and available for good reason, so students can read and learn about those. But sometimes they have scenes in those books of sex and all different kinds of sex. They're not overtly, obviously, sexual or pornographic, as a lot of parents call them. But that we're seeing that now. We're seeing parents demand. So specifically, I just wanted to focus in on that issue because that is happening today, and certainly it has happened throughout history. Talk to me about books that are banned as well as authors that wrote about sexual orientation, because apparently people have been gay forever.
I can point to a couple right off the back. I mentioned already, discussed Sappho of Lesbos, for whom the word lesbian was created in some respects, or inspired the word lesbian. And there's some question as to whether Sappho was actually a lesbian herself. During the 70s, by the way, when the gay rights movement was getting going, especially women had this poster and a book was actually published with this title, Sappho was a right-on woman. Here's this ancient Greek woman who we know very little about, actually, but she became the rallying cry for feminists and especially feminist lesbians in the 1970s. So yes, it's as ancient as that. There's another book in the collection called The Symposium. Symposium, that sounds like a serious thing where a bunch of men in tweedy jackets and ties are sitting around and talking about high ideas. The Symposium actually could be called the drinking party, or I suppose you could even call it the frat party, because a lot of guys are sitting around drinking and talking about sex. That's what the Symposium is about. And when we talk about the Greeks talking about sex, or eros, as they would have described it, which was all love, but also the god of love, also known as Cupid. So here's a really heady piece of philosophy, which is really a bunch of guys laying around in Athens drinking a lot and talking about sex. And they're actually talking sometimes about sex between men, and sometimes they're talking about sex between older men and younger men, which was part of Greek society. So yes, this has been around a long time, and it's not something that people talked about when I read about Plato and Aristotle and Socrates back in college. We didn't get too far into these questions of love and what love means and who we should love. And one character actually describes the highest form of love is this love between men who find an intellectual equal. And that's the kind of love they were talking about. So these are ideas that have been floating around for a long time. And it's no wonder when we talk about censorship that when the church comes into power, the Catholic Church, they suppress these ideas from the ancient Greeks. They don't want people talking about men loving men, and they want to talk about what the church wants to talk about. This is what happens then when we have the great movement called the Renaissance and later the Reformation, because all of these ancient Greek books, which had been suppressed by the church, are being brought back into circulation, and because of the printing press, everyone can read them. They're being translated and they're being made available. This is the reason that the Renaissance and the invention of the printing press go together, because people got to talk about books as ideas once again, and making books that had once been only available to a few people who could read, most of whom were priests or aristocrats. The printing press changed that completely. By the end of the 1500s, there were approximately 100 printing presses around Europe, and they were producing 100,000 books a year. This is just after the time when one person would make one book, and it would take about a year because they were writing illustrated manuscripts. Again, this comes back to this very fundamental idea of the world in books, that books matter. And as I write in the introduction, open books, open minds. When we open books, our minds are opened. And that's really the core of what I'm writing about and talking about here, that we need to keep learning, to keep reading, to keep thinking so that we can understand things about ourselves, but also keep our minds open to new ideas.
One of the things, I love the way you said that, but one of the issues seems to be, and I'm sure even before the internet this was the case, you read books for the reasons you just stated. You then tend to read books in a similar genre, and if we're talking about nonfiction, maybe if you're reading fascism, pro-fascist books and theories, you read more of them. I'm guilty of this. I've spent lots of time reading books by great writers from the civil rights movement and before that movement and after that movement, today's civil rights movement, anti-racism and so on. You include several of these authors that I'm now learning more about, like bell hooks, in this compendium, The World in Books. But what about just the problem that I'm trying to state here is that we don't always read contrasting ideas. I don't need to read pro-slavery, anti-black stuff, I don't think, to broaden my horizons. I don't need to read Mein Kampf. But you do believe in reading a wide range of ideas so we don't get stuck in a silo of one idea, in a lane where we're not taught to, I think, critically think about competing ideas. Say a word about that.
That's a really good point, and I address it in part in later in the book. I talk about the fact that I specifically did not include what I think of as evil books. And let's face it, not all books are good. Not all books are fine and wonderful and expansive. There are terrible books of propaganda that have been dangerous throughout history. Mein Kampf at the top of the list. It's not a great short book because it's 900 pages, so I could exclude it for that reason. But this is part of, I think, the idea that you become, when you read and think and learn for yourself, you develop critical thinking, you are able to discern that a book like Mein Kampf is a really dangerous idea. Now, some people might say that about the Communist Manifesto, but when you read it for yourself, you'll learn it's probably different from the way you thought about it. Yes, it ends up with the final line of workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. That's a message that still reverberates for a lot of people right now, especially since working people have been, especially in this country, really suppressed in many ways, historically and more recently. One of the things I think is so promising and so encouraging about the last few years in this country is the growth and expansion of the organized labor movement. Yes. And for all of Joe Biden's mistakes and flaws, and he is not a perfect person or a perfect president, I truly admire the commitment he's made to working people. When a president stands on the picket line with the United Auto Workers, that sends a very powerful message. So you think that the Communist Manifesto, to take one example of a book that some people might think is dangerous, read it for yourself. Think about it. What is this man actually saying? How has it been misinterpreted over the years? The same thing, I suppose, you could say about another, it's not really a book, it's a pamphlet, but been powerfully dangerous throughout history. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Certainly don't include it in this book, but I reference it. I reference it because it's been so powerful as propaganda. And part of what I'm trying to say here is that we read to learn to think for ourselves, and then you read what the Protocols of the Elders of Zion say. A lot of people are reading it and think it's the truth. It's a piece of propaganda that was created during Tsarist Russia and led to the pogrom of Jews there in the late 19th century and then early into the 20th century. So these are important things to understand from that perspective. There were many books that certainly considered that don't reflect my views, but have been powerfully important, and I include some of them in the back of the book where I list some of the books I didn't include. Like God and Man at Yale by William Buckley is a really powerfully important book in terms of creating the conservative movement in this country from the 1960s on. I would say read it for yourself to see what Buckley has to say. And if you are a thinking person, you might well be able to refute most of what he says. But I do think it's important to look at serious people writing different perspectives. One certainly has to understand, again, not a book I included, but I mentioned it, Milton Friedman's book about economics. Really, again, a document that changed economic conservatism and influenced Ronald Reagan in particular a great deal. So we have to understand these books, even if we don't agree with the ideas all the time.
Very well said. Before I let you go, I want to ask you about a current event that you've written and thought a lot about, and that is the Civil War. Of course. But yesterday, the disgraced former president, as I always refer to him, gave a rally where he stood up for a Confederate general and said he would replace those statues. Trump pledged to rename army bases after Confederate general. Here is the headline. Fort Liberty, previously known as Fort Bragg, was renamed in 2022 as part of a sweeping army push to change the names of installations honoring Confederate soldiers. One of the things that I find so disappointing and disgusting in this country is that is actually controversial. That we haven't years and years ago, like maybe right after the Civil War, written a history where those people were bad, and they would be referred to, in my opinion, now as modern day terrorists. But we are still having to argue about them, and literally on the presidential campaign. So I just wanted to get your updated views on what you think about this controversy of renaming bases, replacing statues, schools, streets, parks, etc., after Confederate leaders, generals.
Okay, that's the key point there. Let's say Confederate, because we're not talking about replacing statues of all Virginian slaveholders, because that would then mean we'd tear down the Washington Monument and the Jefferson Memorial and a few other notable things. No, we're talking about statues honoring Confederate heroes. We can say they were Confederate heroes. But these were men who, in many cases, had taken an oath to defend the nation and the Constitution and broke that oath to join the Confederacy. That was an act of treason. They had broken their oath to defend the country and went over to what they considered a new and different country. And so that is an act of treason. That is why the movement to rename these bases and take down the statues. We don't have statues to Benedict Arnold, the most notorious traitor in American history, because he was a traitor. These men from Robert E. Lee down to Braxton Bragg and all the others were traitors to the cause. They were responsible for the deaths of thousands, if not tens of thousands, of Union soldiers who were once their comrades in arms. It, to me, is a disgraceful and despicable thing. It's in common parlance, it's a dog whistle to say, I don't want to erase this history. We should honor the past. No, we're not honoring treason. And that's what these bases and these statues were. And I should add, and this has been well documented, most of those statues and most of those bases were named in the 1920s and then again a range of them in the 1940s and 50s, largely because of, in the 20s, the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in this country, and the daughters of the American Revolution and the daughters of the Confederacy decided they were going to honor this lost cause ideal at a time when people were first talking about civil rights. The base naming came because the Southern Democrats, who remained in Congress for a long time and were very powerful, especially on Ways and Means and in the defense, the armed services committees, they were the ones who argued for naming these bases in honor of these men who had betrayed their country, because it was still a very clear statement of white supremacy. And that's what we are honoring when we honor these Confederate traitors. We are honoring this ideal that these men fought for white supremacy, to keep slavery in place and to continue it around the rest of the country. That's what the Civil War was fought about. That's what these men broke their oaths to defend the Constitution over, and that's why they can never be honored.
Well said. Very well said. I'm glad that I was able to get to that, because I know I wanted to ask you that. The World in Books is so good, and we've barely scratched the surface. We have to continue talking about it. Maybe you'll join one of our listener hangouts to give us a lesson. We can be in your class. People will have plenty of questions after hearing this interview and going and buying and reading your book. You should get all of Kenneth C. Davis's work, and if you don't have it, then you're really missing out. And it's just the kind of thing that's got to be on your bookshelf, sharing with your family, your kids, and anybody else. You are an American treasure and my favorite historian. I really appreciate your time today, as always, my friend.
Thanks, Pete. And for those who don't know, you can go to don'tknowmuch.com and see all the books and see what I think about.
Don'tknowmuch.com. Do it today. Don'tknowmuch.com. There he goes, everybody. Kenneth C. Davis. Get the book, The World in Books, 52 works of great short nonfiction. So good. One of the most anticipated books of the fall. And I'm very happy to have it out and to have talked about it. I hope that you'll go get it. Thank you very much for listening to the show today. I can't do it without your support. Patreon.com/Pete Dominick here at the beginning of October. I'm so glad to have you with me in the 30 days that remain between now and the election. Still so much work to do, and I plan to do it. Cannot do it without your support. I love you guys, especially you bumblebees who listen all the way to the end. John Carroll writes and performs all the music on this show. Support him at johncarroll.org. Take it away, John.
For the burning trees, you got to stand up. Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you got to stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels with leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. You got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear and all you hear is a lie. Don't get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it is the time to go and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. Alright, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside. And listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.